with all the news about Syrian refugees, with the attacks in Paris and strong backlash in certain quarters against admitting refugees, this would be a good time to review our history on the topic of this nation's willingness or unwillingness to accept other refugees at different points in history. Joining us now to talk about that is Ishaan Tharoor, who is a foreign affairs correspondent for The Washington Post. Ishaan was previously a senior editor at Time in Hong Kong and then later in New York, and he wrote a piece recently called What Americans Thought of Jewish Refugees on the Eve of World War II. Ishaan, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me on.
So you've written actually several pieces on this subject this week, but your piece on what Americans thought of refugees on the eve of World War II, and of course we know how tragically that ended. Basically, there was enormous reluctance on the part of Americans to admit refugees then as well, right?
Right. The piece cites two polls that were conducted in 1938 and 1939, just in the build-up to World War II, that showed considerable majority of Americans adamantly opposed towards raising immigration quotas and also letting in Jewish and political refugees from Europe who were fleeing fascism at the time. So what it illustrated to me was it was a good snapshot of the kind of just tradition of nativism that we do see in American politics and that does crop up from time to time, especially in the context of these sorts of discussions about refugees coming in.
Yeah, and what it shows is that there was a strong resistance back then. I think the first poll in July of 1938 shows 67.4% of people saying under current conditions we should try to keep German and Austrian political refugees out. Of course, the large majority of those were Jewish. And as you point out, that first poll was conducted before Kristallnacht, that wave of anti-Jewish violence took place. But its second poll was conducted after Kristallnacht, well after, in January of 1939, which showed that even when it came to accepting 10,000 refugee children from Germany, most of them Jewish, it specifies, should the government permit these children to come in, 61% said no.
Right, and I came across this poll on the day that a Republican presidential candidate declared that he wouldn't even want to take in a 3-year-old Syrian refugee orphan. So it really, really struck me at that point. These numbers are pretty stark, and they tell a story. What I think is also very important to point out, especially considering some of the reaction I've seen in the aftermath of this piece, is that very similarly to the way that especially Republican politicians right now are grandstanding on the issue of Syrian refugees, they're saying that this is, there's a fear that through the refugees we'll have Islamist infiltrators, that many of these refugees will not assimilate, that they can present a dangerous ideology. What's really important to point out is that go back 80 years, and a very similar narrative is in place. Jews, especially Jews, were seen as agents of a kind of dangerous foreign ideology, namely communism, anarchism. And the political rhetoric at the time was very, very similar to what we're hearing right now. There was fears of Jewish conspiracies, fears of spies and fifth columnists coming through the ranks of refugees. So the resonance is not just the fact that reflects a nativism. The rhetoric was really similar as well.
Yeah, and you addressed that in a follow-up piece, Ishaan Tharoor of the Washington Post, entitled, "Yes, the comparison between Jewish and Syrian refugees matters." That was the headline given. Pointing out that, in fact, many of those same fears were in place then. You quote a Capitol Hill lobbyist. You cite a quotation of a Capitol Hill lobbyist mentioned in The Intercept, saying in the Nazi persecution of Jews had occurred, quote, in very many cases because because of their belief in the Marxian philosophy, and then references to communistic Jews and international financiers and all that. So, while you do also quote another expert from Time magazine saying the situations are not exactly parallel, it certainly seems that there is a strong similarity in response here. Any thoughts on what might be underlying this kind of reflexive reaction to the idea of taking in people in need?
Well, I think this is a conversation we're having right now in the midst of an election cycle. It's proven very clear that to a certain base, segment of the electorate in this country, that the politics of fear and perhaps certain xenophobic lines work, and it's very important to see this conversation about Syrian refugees right now in the U.S. in parallel to a very different conversation taking place in Europe right now, which is much more focused on the actual security threats that are faced. And again, this is the kind of xenophobia and sort of scaremongering over Jewish refugees in the 1930s was also part of emerged from a very particular political context there as well, and traded on the fears of a certain segment of the population then as well. So I would say that politics is and the expediency of certain politics is a large part of it. I also think it's really, on a separate note, I think it's also really worth pointing out that the issue of refugees in general, it's just tangential to the Paris terror attack. So it's rather remarkable that it's become the centerpiece of the conversation here. Since the Paris attacks.
It's tangential in the sense that we now know that none of the attackers in the Paris attack were refugees or came in through the refugee process. They were European, if I understand that correctly.
Correct.
Right?
Well, so far, none of the identified assailants are Syrian nationals. And all of them are European nationals. And there's one sort of curious piece of evidence of a fake Syrian passport and somebody linked to that fake Syrian passport having transited through a refugee processing center in Greece. But who that person was, what the actual connection is to the terror attack, none of this is clear. So there's a shred of evidence that implicates hundreds of thousands of refugees. And it's become now a situation where you have Americans saying we don't want any refugees at all, when there's a clear international responsibility on the part of the Western community in particular to help take them in.
And in a sense, one could argue, and I don't want to put you on the spot as a journalist, but one could argue that the United States, having destabilized Iraq, has a greater moral responsibility than the average nation in this case. France, which was, of course, the site of the Paris attacks, has indicated it will continue or to honor its commitment to accept 30,000 refugees. So,
right.
So on the other hand, we have this backlash and this desire not to. And I wanted to get back to this issue of the politician saying that he would not even accept a child of 3 or under. Doesn't that suggest appealing not only to fear, but to a sense of genetic or something? I mean, it struck me the connection between that comment and the 1939 poll saying we don't want to take in 30,000 children. Why this fear of children?
Well, look, this is, without speaking too directly to that specific politician, we're at a moment where there are, fears over economic competition, there are fears over cultural takeover. There are genuine security concerns that people have about safety in the United States in the time of instability and violence elsewhere in the world. These are legitimate concerns. There were legitimate concerns in the 1930s as well. This is a country that was coming out of the Great Depression, where large numbers of Americans at the time were unemployed. So the reflexive hostility towards refugees and immigration can be also seen in that context prism as well. To go back to your point about French and their role in the U.S. and its role, it is interesting that France has been really front and center in recent years, pushing for the departure of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. Now it has to recast its response to the situation in Syria more as a kind of effort now to destroy the Islamic State. they've had a lot of strategic conundrums now as a result. It's and in general, the responsibility, the U.S., of course, as the world's reigning superpower, as a country that has the capacity and the means to really help, it has a responsibility. So do other countries. It's really important to also emphasize that while in the past few months we've seen this refugee crisis as a kind of European crisis or a crisis facing the West, the real crisis, humanitarian disaster, is unfolding in Syria and in the states surrounding Syria. Countries like Turkey, which is facing a Syrian influx of 2 million plus refugees, Lebanon seeing over 1 million, that's a quarter of its population. This is where the real pressing need is, and the US and the EU and the richer Gulf states all have a huge role to play in helping alleviate the burdens.
And that's well said, I think. And we're talking with Ishaan Tharoor of the Washington Post about the refugee situation. I would add to that that whatever element of this fear comes not from economic roots but from national security roots, obviously anytime anyone transits from one place to another, I suppose it poses a risk. But the fact is that refugees by nature are fleeing the Islamic State. They are rejecting it physically at risk of their own life and limb and escaping a humanitarian crisis in the process, which gets me to something else you've written about recently, which is a poll of the latest Pew survey, I believe it's the latest Pew survey of global attitudes conducted earlier this year in 11 majority Muslim countries, showing that the populations of those countries oppose the Islamic State by staggering amounts, including the Muslim Shia population of Lebanon views it 100% unfavorable, understandable given the conflicts between them. But the Sunni population of Lebanon, 98% unfavorable view. Arab population of Israel, 91% unfavorable view, and so on. So this notion that the refugees, by the way, not all of whom are Muslim, but that by any means, but that Muslims somehow are associated with the Islamic State. Aren't we really, when we talk about refugees, talking about people who are the victims of the Islamic State and its ideology?
Absolutely, and of course, it's not just victims of the Islamic State; it's victims of the rather heavy-handed repression of the Assad regime as well, which has killed as many Syrian civilians, if not more, than the Islamic State. So it's these are people who are half the country of Syria. Half the country has been forced to flee from their homes. That's an astonishing, staggering figure. And these are people who are not doing this by choice. They're doing this because their country is completely unraveled and the world has watched. And as you said, of course, it's no surprise that the vast majority of Muslims in this world don't support the Islamic State. The vast majority of people the Islamic State is killing are Muslims.
Right.
So it's to automatically inflate the jihadist threat with hundreds of thousands, millions of Syrians seeking sanctuary, seeking a better life in a really miserable context is tragic and unfair. And you'd all said it's very, very similar to people 80 years ago seeing in the desperation of Jewish refugees fleeing Europe the specter of some communist takeover.
So I guess I would only say, as a matter of my personal opinion, that one of the best antidotes to prejudice and fear is information, and that I personally appreciate the information you've been disseminating on this subject. Ishaan Tharoor, foreign affairs reporter for the Washington Post, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.